In this part of the module, we will talk about the theory of porous censorship and why certain governments or entities may in fact have a goal to let certain communications pass through a censorship firewall or regime and not outright block everything. And beyond that, why governments or other organizations may also use tactics in addition to blocking or fear in an attempt to develop a more sophisticated or effective censorship regime. So it's worth noting that censorship is not always a ban or a block. And many censorship methods, particularly those implemented in countries like China, act not necessarily as a ban, but really as a tax on access to information or communication, where users might need to pay more money or spend more time to get access to the information that they're trying to get access to. So in 2010, when China purportedly blocked Google in their country, the block wasn't an outright ban or a complete 100% block. It was implemented in such a way that search results failed about 75% of the time. Why did China choose to implement the block that way? Well, the reading, in particular, Molly Roberts' research on porous censorship has some explanations for that. In particular, outright bans or blocks can sometimes backfire, whereas a porous filter can achieve the same effect without necessarily producing the same kind of backlash. One of the effects of porous censorship is that if a service or communication endpoint is reachable some of the time, or with a certain amount of effort, or at a certain cost, then determined individuals might still be able to access that information. And yet the barrier that's been raised to access that information is enough to deter the majority of the population. So introducing friction in search engines is one way that porous censorship is implemented. And another way that it's implemented is by developing filters based on keywords that citizens can ultimately evade through homophones, VPNs, and other types of technologies that can be used to evade censorship. This is what Roberts sometimes calls friction, in particular implementations of censorship that are possible to evade, but just more difficult. In other words, they require the user or the citizen some additional amount of effort to implement that circumvention. So a key question in understanding censorship is understanding why governments attempt to control information at all when these controls are easily circumvented. And in some sense, that's not a technical question. That's a social or a political question that we can explore more in discussion and that we'll explore more deeply in later modules in the course. But it's something that's important to keep in mind throughout the course, because when we think about censorship, it's often not implemented in a binary on or off or kill switch style fashion like the example we saw in Egypt. It's much more common for a government or an organization to introduce or implement censorship through techniques like friction. We already talked a little bit about the taxonomy of modern censorship, but I want to talk about the technical implementations of some of these. So let's quickly review. Fear makes people afraid to publish or view content, and that's really a conventional notion of censorship. The more modern facets and what we're seeing implemented and deployed in an increasing fashion are friction, whereby a censor makes it more difficult to find or access content, and flooding, effectively diluting discourse with additional distracting or irrelevant information. And while we commonly associate censorship with the first bullet, fear, and think about that being implemented in so-called oppressive regimes, Roberts makes a very astute point that even Western democracies are particularly vulnerable to censorship as implemented through friction and flooding. So going back to the question of why governments implement censorship techniques that are sometimes easily evaded, it turns out that small inconveniences are often more effective than big barriers. A small inconvenience or a technical implementation of friction might be made to look like a technical failure. For example, it may be difficult to distinguish an internet outage or an unreliable website, or simply slower speed, a web page that loads more slowly, or search results that come back more slowly or unreliably, from a technical failure versus an overt political action. And that can afford the government or the censor some level of plausible deniability, because it's reasonably hard for a user to determine whether or not that what they're observing is some overt censorship action or whether it's simply a technical failure in the network or the service. Sometimes small inconveniences are hard to definitively identify as censorship at all. So if a search result is buried on the second or third page of results, or if a news story is placed on the back pages of a website or a newspaper, that may be difficult to affirmatively assert that censorship is absolutely taking place versus that outcome being the result of some automated algorithm or even an editorial decision. The implementation of internet censorship through small inconveniences is the future of censorship, viewed in the broader lens of information control, where the information that we have access to and that's being produced is so great that there's competition for people's attention. And it may not be necessary to outright block information or prevent access to a site or service if the censor can merely distract the user, sending the user's attention towards other content or services, causing them to choose one search engine over another or one news site over another, maybe even for a simple reason that one appears to perform better than the other. And again, it's worth noting that all of these mechanisms that we're describing in the small inconvenience category can be more effective, and one of the reasons that they're more effective is that they provide plausible deniability to the censor. In short, porous censorship is effective because it has holes. Direct repression can sometimes cause backlash, and inconveniencing the population is often sufficient because small costs for access can have significant effects on the majority of the population. And affecting the majority is often what a government is interested in doing, leaving the extreme cases to perhaps more targeted action. And as we'll see, customized approaches can be very effective because with a menu of options for how a censor chooses to implement information control, a censor can select a particular implementation that may be appropriate in one scenario or for a particular subpopulation where it might be less appropriate in other circumstances. And it turns out that the uses of friction and flooding often work in most scenarios, whereas fear can be reserved for cases of more sophisticated citizens or users.